Tamam. İyi akşamlar değerli dilbilim severler. 72.sini düzenlediğimiz İzmir Dilbilim Çevresi etkinliklerine hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Bugün Profesör Francisco Mendoza'yı dinleyeceğiz. Kendisi hakkında bilgi vermesi için sözü ben Özgün hocama bırakacağım. İşleyişimizi artık biliyorsunuz. Yeni gelenler için hatırlatayım. Sunumunu yaptıktan sonra hocamıza chatbox'tan ya da sözlü olarak el kaldırarak sırayla sorularınızı sorabilirsiniz. Teşekkürler. Buyurun hocam.
Teşekkür ederim Esra. Esteemed Professor, dear participants, I would like to welcome you for the 72nd of İzmir Linguistic Circle meetings. Before we start, I would like to inform you, all of you, that this session is being recorded and will later be broadcasted on on our YouTube channel. Today, we are welcoming Professor Francisco Ruiz de Mendoza Ibáñez from La Rioja University in Spain. We would like to thank Professor Mendoza for accepting our invitation. We think that our students and our participants in Turkey and other participants as well will benefit from this presentation. As is customary to İzmir Linguistic Circle meetings, our session starts with a brief introduction of our guests, followed by a 45-50 minutes presentation and then a 15-20 minutes question and answer section. With your permission, I would like to introduce to you Professor Francisco Ruiz de Mendoza. Professor Mendoza has published nearly 180 research papers in international journals and book series. He has edited or co-edited 8 books and authored or co-authored 9 books, the most prominent of which are Cognitive Modeling, A Linguistic Perspective, published in 2014, 10 lectures on cognitive modeling between grammar and language-based inferencing in 2021, Modeling Irony, A Cognitive Pragmatic Account in 2022, and Figuring Out Figuration, A Cognitive Linguistic Account, again in 2022. Professor Mendoza has been invited over 200 occasions around the world in the universities. He has been editor to many respectable journals and series. He also co-founded the Spanish Association for Cognitive Linguistics in 1998. Today, Professor Mendoza will make a presentation titled Cognitive and Pragmatic Dimensions of Echoicity in Irony, Accuracy, Complexity, and Marking. Dear Professor, the word is yours.
So thank you very much. It's very kind of you to invite me to take part of your linguistic circle, and I hope that the topic that I brought will be of interest for the audience. So as you said, I'm going to talk about cognition and pragmatics in connection with the notion of echoicity in irony. Let me see if this will work. Yes. So first of all, let me address this question. What is echoic mention? This notion is very old. It goes back to the 1970s and 80s in linguistics, especially in pragmatics, and it is taken from the philosophy of language. Basically, echoic mention is a repetition of what someone has said or of an attributed thought. It doesn't matter whether the thought is individual or social. So, for example, social stereotypes would be the target of echoic mention. Echoic mention is meta-representational. It is the representation of a previous representation, whether the representation is formal or it is semantic. Echoic mention can be both denotational or non-denotational or attitudinal in meaning. To give you some examples, in the case of denotational echoic mention, we have reported speech. For example, when you say something like, she said she'd be back home before midnight. This is a report on what she said. But you also have expressions of realization or agreement. Take this brief dialogue. Detective 1, they're in the scene of a murder, of a crime, and Detective 1 says, that was a possible abduction case. Detective 2, admitting to it as an almost inevitable deduction on the basis of the evidence, says possible abduction. There are also attitudinal inferences associated with echoic mention. One of them is the repetition of social stereotypes. Spaniards always sleep the siesta. people will say that when they want to accuse Spaniards of doing something that is wrong from a cultural perspective. It's not a good idea to sleep the siesta because you should use that time to engage in your daily work activities. Also to express admiration or astonishment. Mary says, many say he's a real Superman, and Jeanette, he is a real Superman. You can report on non-lexicalized feelings or thoughts. This is a very interesting use of language. Sentences like, I felt like, oh my God, what is going to happen here? Or, oh my goodness, what did I just do? You express your feelings through a situational part for whole metonymy, where oh my God or oh my goodness stands for a situation that in which you would, as a speaker, normally express yourself or exclaim, oh my goodness, or oh my God. You also find echoic mention in metonymy-based emotional reactions. The example here is the daughter says to daddy, come on, daddy, and the father replies, don't daddy me. The father is upset. The father doesn't want to be called daddy, to be persuaded into something that he wouldn't like to do. And also we have parodic echoes, which are not based on the repetition of form for its content, but on the repetition or the imitation of form for the sake of form. For example, imagine that we have a classroom context. The teacher usually starts his classes by saying, well, let's pick it up today from where we left off yesterday. And a student makes fun of the teacher by saying sotto voce, let's pick it up where I bored you off. And the imitation of form brings about meaning implications in terms of laughter, humor, and so on. Now, the question that I have is, if you observed the previous slides, you must have noticed that we had a couple of denotational uses of echoic mention, but most of the interesting uses are non-denotational, they are attitudinal. Why? Why is that the case? A possible answer is that, of course, there is redundancy in repetition. If there is redundancy in repetition, that's because the repetition conveys something else, which goes beyond the mere repetition of what someone said. To offset the lack of economy of redundancy, speakers endow the utterance with attitudinal overtones. And of course, the exception is context, where an echo is needed to repair informational gaps. Echoic mention, I will refer to this now as echoing, has been put forward by relevance theorists in inferential pragmatics as being at the core of the meaning of irony, or the production of irony. And the point here is that what they say is that the ironic echo is the total or partial reproduction of a previous thought or utterance combined with an attitude of dissociation. And that's the case of irony. So ironic echoes would be different from other echoes in that the attitudinal component is one of skepticism, questioning a situation that the speaker may not like or may not agree with. Another approach that is based on this idea has been developed by myself and some of my associates at the Universidad de La Rioja. We call it the scenario-based approach. And our point is that an echo is a form of expressing pretended agreement, and that at the core of irony, the central notion is not that of echoing, but one of expressing pretended agreement. I will give you some examples, but take, for example, the following dialogue between John and Paul. John says, I had dinner with the Prime Minister yesterday. Of course, Paul doesn't take it and says, yeah, sure. You say, yeah, sure, you're questioning the belief or the assumption expressed by the interlocutor. I had dinner with the Prime Minister. No, you didn't. But another way of expressing the same idea instead of these agreement adverbs is repeating the same utterance. You had dinner with the Prime Minister yesterday. I don't believe it. That's the implication behind this. Or it can be combined with you're unsure, and then the resulting utterance becomes more emphatic. Yeah, sure, you had dinner with the Prime Minister yesterday, meaning I don't take it, I don't believe you. This scenario-based approach was initially postulated by myself like 5 or 6 years ago, and it was later developed by Ines Lozano and myself last year. It was published in the book Modeling Irony. An ironic echo in this approach is the result of reproducing totally or partially, with varying degrees of accuracy, either the explicit and or the implicit meaning that arises from an utterance or a set of utterances, or from a set of assumptions attributed to someone. It is used to build an echoic scenario through a metonymic operation of domain expansion. What domain expansion does is allow the echo to acquire as much conceptual material as is necessary for the contrast with what the speaker believes is the real world situation. This is an example of how this idea works on the basis of a simple echo. Imagine that we have Bob and Peter. Bob is keen on alien contacts and fantasizes about being taken by aliens to other galaxies. Peter thinks Bob should stop fantasizing. And Peter says to Bob, yeah, sure, Bob, by aliens. The echoic scenario is a situation in which Peter pretends to agree with Bob about alien contacts and that he would love to be taken by aliens to other galaxies. You will observe that the echoic scenario includes a lot more information than simply what is said from a linguistic perspective. The explicit utterance is simply, yeah, sure, Bob, by aliens. This has to be expanded, which is a metonymic operation, into the more complex representation that I have just mentioned. The echoic scenario clashes with the observable situation, with what everyone should know from the point of view of the speaker. It is the opposite of the echoic scenario. And from the clash between the echoic scenario and the observable scenario, which is reality, there arises an attitudinal inference, which is that Peter is skeptical and also concerned about Bob's beliefs on aliens. I have been talking about inferences. At the core of irony is the notion of inferential activity. Irony produces inferences. And how do they happen? My point here is that irony is based on two inferential stages that are combined with each other. This is called an inferential chain, or simply chained inferences. This inferential chaining happens by using the implicated conclusion of the first part of a reasoning schema to fill in the conditioned part of the premise in a second reasoning schema. And it is the second inferential stage that gives rise to the attitudinal inference that is typical of irony. For example, imagine for the previous example about Bob's beliefs in aliens, we would have a premise that we have to retrieve from what we already know about Bob that Bob would love to be taken by aliens to other galaxies. Then we have the observable scenario that clashes with this premise. In the observable scenario, which is real life, at least from someone's point of view, visiting other galaxies is impossible and will likely remain impossible during the lifetime of both the speaker and the hearer. The conclusion is that the speaker thinks that what the hearer wants is impossible, and he wants the hearer to become aware that it is impossible. The second reasoning schema is connected to the first one. You will observe, let me go back to the implicated conclusion. The implicated conclusion, which is in blue typeface, was that the speaker thinks that what the hearer wants is impossible. This implicated conclusion now becomes the explicit meaning part of a second reasoning schema. Let me go back again. That was the observable scenario. This explicit meaning is based on what can be attested. The premise is drawn from cultural convention. We have the cultural convention that we should not contradict other people unless we want to prove them wrong, which is impolite, or we want to express our dissociation from what they think, which may also be impolite, but it might be milder. The explicit meaning is taken from the previous reasoning schema, number 1, and it's the idea that the speaker thinks that the hearer what the hearer wants is not possible. And the implicated conclusion here, which is taken from the part of the premise that is not invoked by the previous implicated conclusion, is that the speaker wants to prove the hearer wrong, or to express dissociation from what the hearer thinks. In the case of irony, you don't want only to prove that the hearer is wrong. You want to express your dissociation. You want to say, I'm skeptical about what you say. I won't buy that. The notion of ironic echo can be addressed from various perspectives. I have selected 4 of them. One is the nature of the source of irony. A second one is the degree of its representational and communicative accuracy. Then, third one is its formally complete or partial nature. And the fourth one is the complexity of irony. Here are some sources of ironic echoes, which is one of them is what someone said, someone's previous utterance, and that could include the speaker himself or herself. For example, imagine that the forecast said that it was not going to rain, that it was impossible, then it rains, and you say, yeah, exactly what the weather forecast said, no chance of precipitation. That's ironic. It could be someone's previous thoughts, and these thoughts, of course, we can't know about people's thoughts for sure. We speculate about them. So we have to attribute those thoughts to someone, and once we do that, we will be able to produce irony by repeating those thoughts in the most approximate way that we can. Sure, I'm planning on our revenge. That's just like me. So this is questioning the idea that I'm planning on our revenge. That's not me. You're attributing the wrong thoughts to me. We can also ironize on social stereotypes and use an ironic echo to word those, to flesh out those social stereotypes from a linguistic perspective. So, for example, there is this idea that Spanish people sleep the siesta, which is not a correct idea. And maybe in some parts of Spain they have to sleep the siesta because it's terribly hot at midday, but that's not the case for the rest of the country. But we have this social stereotype, and the speaker can question it by saying something like, yeah, right, I'm a Spaniard, so I sleep a long siesta every day. The implication of this social stereotype is that Spanish people are lazy people that are not working the whole day. And using irony, you can question that social stereotype. And also, we can have implicit cultural or social norms that are violated by someone's observable actions as they are manifest to the speaker. So we have a traffic regulation that says that we have to signal when we turn as we drive, and sometimes drivers don't do it. And you can ironize on that by saying, I love it when drivers give a turn signal, meaning that it hasn't happened. The echo here is implicit. Drivers should give a turn signal, and it hasn't happened in this case. Let's go now to accuracy. An echo is not necessarily an exact repetition of what someone said. It can be an interpretation of what someone said, showing different degrees of accuracy with respect to the form of what is said. And this is what allows us precisely to echo people's thoughts, since we can only make guesses as to their nature. We go back to the aliens example. Peter could have exaggerated the strength of Bob's beliefs by making his echo inaccurate. You will see in the addition in bold typeface in the following, in the dialogue. Peter says, yeah, sure, Bob. In the original example, it was, yeah, sure, Bob, by aliens. In the new example, we add, of course. Yeah, sure, Bob, of course, by aliens. And Bob could have replied, it's just something that came to mind, Peter. However, it would be great if it could come true, right? But who knows? So Bob could have exaggerated the strength of his assumptions about the strength of Bob's beliefs with an inaccurate echo, and Bob doesn't take it. Echoes can be full or partial. We can have different meaning effects that arise from handling the ironic echo in a full or a partial way. You have an example here of a father making a promise to his son, and it's a broken promise. The father fails to fulfill it, and the son is disappointed. So the father says to his son, "Son, I wouldn't miss your graduation ceremony for anything in the world." And the son, after the father has disappointed him, says, "Yeah, right, for anything in the world." Now, the son doesn't say, "Son, I wouldn't miss your graduation ceremony for anything in the world." Yeah, right. He could have said that, but instead of doing that, he focuses on the last part of the sentence, for anything in the world. By focusing on this part of the sentence, which is a partial echo, he suggests that the father traded honoring him for what actually was most important to him. The point here is that a full echo would have missed the focus on the idea that anything in the world could in fact be more important than his own son. We address now the issue of complexity. At the beginning of this talk, I gave an example, a very simple example of ironic echo. And we saw that the clash between the echo and reality, the echoic scenario and the observable scenario, is what gives rise to inferences which are based on convention that the speaker is skeptical about what the hearer believes or what somebody else believes, the echoed thought. We are going to see how this function of ironic echoes can be strengthened on the basis of complexity. And well, that's not the only way of enhancing the strength of an ironic echo. We may have time to give a couple of examples, but we're going to focus first on cultural and social historical references that could make an ironic echo complex, then on the phenomenon called compounding, then on accumulation or cumulative echoes, then echoic chains, and finally multi-operational echoes. We begin with cultural and social historical references. It is impossible to interpret irony unless we can make a mental picture in our minds of what the ironist is actually referring to. Because when we ironize, there is an epistemic component, there is a belief component. And unless we can identify that component, it would be impossible to work out the inferential, the attitudinal inferences, the inferential part of irony. One example of what could be a complex case of irony in terms of cultural attributes, cultural features, is, for example, this film, the animated feature film Monsters, Inc. Monsters are cultural constructs, and we know, for example, the Hydra in Greek culture, Leviathan in Hebrew, in the Hebrew culture, and so on. In Monsters, Inc., which is a corporation run by monsters that have to scare children, ironically, the monsters are the ones that are constantly afraid of children. The cultural constructs, the Hydra, the Leviathan, the Yeti, they are terrible creatures. They can do harm to people. They scare us. In the case of this animated feature film, we have the reverse situation, which is a very interesting one. And this is ironic. We have an echoed scenario, which is the belief that children are scared by monsters like everyone else. But then we have an observable scenario, which is provided by the film, and the audience realize as the film moves on that this is the situation, that monsters are afraid of children. And the spectators are thus led to dissociate themselves from their normal cultural expectations about monsters. This is a case of situational irony. Another case of the importance of culture, in this case it's social historical knowledge, is provided by Swift's A Modus Proposal. The social historical context here is the harsh policies of England on Ireland. And Swift, pretending to be a high-class Englishman, ironically proposes that 1/6 of Irish children be served as food for the English upper class. Now, what Swift says echoes the English belief that Irish people are worthless. It is obviously hyperbolic, it is an exaggeration. And this clashes with his own personal beliefs about the value of human beings, which is about what he wants to raise awareness in the audience. The interpreter needs to have knowledge about the social cultural context, or the whole text will not make any sense, and the reader will be unable to identify the ironic echo and might take Swift literally and believe that he is a monster. Now we go into a less cultural, more local phenomenon, which is called compounding. Compounding happens when two or more echoes are combined syntactically to make reference to different parts of one single ironic event. We go back to the sleeping the siesta example. Peter says, remember, yeah, right, I sleep siesta. But in the context here, it's Peter and John is lazy, he rarely works, and Peter does all the work and never takes time to relax. But, ironically, John complains to Peter about how unproductive Peter has been for the past few days. And Peter says, ironically, yeah, right, I sleep siesta while you do all the work, as usual. We have a combination of echoes that are related when combined through compounding. One is the idea that that Peter sleeps the siesta, which is ironic towards John's claim about Peter's habits, because it contrasts with what Peter thinks about his own habits. And then you do all the work as usual refers to what John seems to think about his own behavior, but is actually not the case from Peter's point of view. And it contrasts with Peter's beliefs on John's work habits. One of the interesting things about compounding is that it allows us to integrate loosely associated echoes. So we may have echoes that are not clearly connected, but once we bring them together through compounding, they become tightly connected. An example is provided here. You have a schoolboy that for the first time has passed 3 exams out of 11. That's a record. And he asks his sister about their mother's reaction, because his mother once said with resignation that she would be more than happy if he passed but 1 class. And probably he took that literally. And he says, "Oh, Mom will be thrilled about my academic success." And the schoolboy's sister echoes what the son believes and replies, "Oh yeah, right, Mom will be thrilled about your academic success," which is a way of saying, no, this is not going to happen. So we have 2 echoes. One is the belief that their mother will be thrilled, and that's based on the past remark that she once made to her son. And the second one is that the boy is naive. The boy believes that he has done well because he passed 3 classes rather than just 1. And these 2 echoes stand in a tight consequence-cause relation. The mother's promised positive reaction is a consequence of the boy's success in the boy's mind. And that's what the boy's sister expresses through the ironic repetition of the combination of these 2 ideas. Another complex form of echo is provided by cumulation. In some ironic contexts, multiple echoic terms appear consecutively and refer to the same ironic target with the same ironic meaning. The formation of these echoes takes place by the accumulation of terms that cause similar clashes with the observed scenario, thus forming one single reinforced echo. So this is a situation in which we make use of words that can be complementary to one another in building or in strengthening an idea that is already held in the speaker's mind about someone. In the example, imagine that the speaker believes that Mary is not a great person at all, but says Mary is an angel, repeating what someone previously had said or thought. So someone says, "No, Mary is an angel." That person is naive about Mary, about Mary's qualities. And then the new speaker behaves ironically and says, "No," and tries to convey the idea that, no, Mary is not an angel at all. Mary is not good at all. And he works through cumulation by saying, Mary is an angel, a saint, a gem, a real treasure, which in the context of the clash between the echoic scenario and the observable scenario reinforces the echoic element to make the clash more emphatic. These words, angel, saint, gem, treasure, refer to the same ironic target. They complement one another. To some extent, they have synonymic elements, and they reinforce this idea that Mary's behavior is not exemplary at all. So this strategy has an intensifying function. Then we come to echoic chains, which is a very interesting phenomenon. And it's much more complex than I will be able to explain here. Echoic chains are formed when an echo is built completely or partially on a previous echo. We have a conversation between John and Paul. This is about Donald Trump. And John expresses his belief that Donald Trump could win the next election. And Paul doesn't believe that, and he says, yeah, sure, Trump could win. This is the first ironic echo. Of course, Paul does not believe that Trump could win. But then Trump unexpectedly wins, and Paul comes back and says, and John, that's a mistake. And John comes back to Paul and says, yeah, sure, and Trump could win. Which is a second ironic echo that acts on the first echo. What are the meaning implications here? First, that Trump couldn't possibly win in the first echo. Now, in the second one, yeah, sure, and Trump could win. Paul's view that Trump couldn't possibly win is wrong, since Trump has won. And the first echo questioned one belief, and the second echo questions the first the implicit belief is expressed in the first echo. Sometimes ironic echoes can combine with metaphor, metonymy, and hyperbole. At least, this serves to reinforce the attitudinal element of irony, very much in the same way as with cumulative echoes, or to create more sophisticated echoes. We can call this multi-operational echoing. An example of irony combined with metaphor and hyperbole is, take the dialogue, Mary is an angel, and the other speaker says skeptically, yeah, right, a real treasure. Now, this is of course an inaccurate echo. It is also partial, but it addresses the essential meaning implications of Mary is an angel. The first speaker preserves the intensifying effect of the metaphor and hyperbole arising from the use of angel, and the second speaker, speaker B, echoes Mary's kindness by mapping the positive connotations of a treasure, because treasures are worth keeping and they bring material wealth and happiness, onto Mary's perceived behavior. And this echo clashes with what B actually believes, because B is behaving ironically. Irony can also work through metonymy. Sophocles' tragedy Oedipus, the king. In this tragedy, Oedipus stands for mankind, is a metonymy for mankind. The function of this metonymy is to enhance the cathartic effect of the play, since the audience see themselves as members of mankind, and therefore they are potential objects of the same kind of fate as poor Oedipus. As you will remember in the play, the oracle, Apistis, had predicted that Oedipus would kill his father and marry his mother. And Oedipus, all through the play, struggles to escape this fate. And sometimes he thinks he's going to be successful because he receives signals that things are working out. But in the end, he makes a number of serious mistakes. And he doesn't realize that he's making those mistakes. And he falls prey to fate. The irony arises from the clash between Oedipus's misinterpretations and what the audience, but not the protagonist, knows is reality as observed on the stage. Irony can combine with hyperbole, and sometimes hyperbole can take very interesting shapes. We have an interesting example here. You have, yeah, right, Mary's an angel, which is expanded into Mary's an angel, every inch of her. Now, think about the communicative power of every inch of her. It arises from combining metaphor and hyperbole, strengthening the metaphor, and also strengthening the ironic effect. How do the metaphor and hyperbole combine? Well, by saying every inch of her, Mary is ascribed pervasive good moral behavior without exception, which is of course impossible, and that's the hyperbole. And this extremely hyperbolic echo enhances the clash between the echoed and the observed scenarios, thereby becoming an efficient resource to highlight the ironist's attitude of dissociation from the echoed thought. We now go into another topic, which is one of called. This is one of how irony is pointed to through textual resources, and also through paratextual resources. Attardo has dealt with this, and quite a few scholars have dealt with this idea. So this is a very common observation, that irony is usually accompanied by a special intonation pattern, by a special stress prominence, often by some morphological devices, and then in written text by typographical means, but kinesic markers like winks and nudges, and of course, it has to happen in certain contexts that feature specific contextual elements. We need the co-occurrence of incompatible elements in the same sentence or between the sentence and the context of situation. This has been called by Attardo indices of irony. And it is suggested that when this special intonation pattern, stress prominence, and kinesic markers and so on co-occur with a potentially ironic text, the ironic interpretation is ensured. It is a way of leading the hearer into an ironic interpretation by default. And this is a great idea, because in fact it happens that way. For example, when I say, yeah, right, Mary's an angel, I don't simply say neutrally, yeah, right, Mary's an angel. What I say is, yeah, right, Mary's an angel. I use a special intonational pattern. What is missing here is the notion of echoic markers. For example, the adverbial expressions that we have already mentioned in some examples that have the canonical pragmatic function of showing agreement. So when you say yes, what you mean is I agree with you. When you say right, it's about the same, or sure, or certain. And these can be combined. When they combine, they serve as a strong pointer to the possibility of ironic meaning. It's not the same to say Mary's an angel than yeah, right, or yeah, sure, or yeah, sure, right. Mary's an angel. Echoic markers do not directly mark irony, but they mark the existence of an echo that can be interpreted as ironic if the rest of the elements of the ironic act are present. They may be used to express other pragmatic functions. They're not exclusive of irony, but they have a very important role in creating irony. They may be repeated for emphasis of the ironic effect, and this is especially so when marked by a slow prosodic tempo. It's not the same to say, yeah, Mary's an angel, as yeah, Mary's an angel, or yeah, sure, Mary's an angel. So they can be combined and actually express in a clear way the emphasis that is associated with the ironic effect. In terms of communicative effects, the role of echoic markers is not very different from that of cumulative echoes. Think of this example. We have a family reunion, and Uncle Jim behaves foolishly, and he is criticized by two of his nephews. Nephew 1 says, Uncle Jim, the pride of the family. And nephew 2 says, a jewel in the crown. Or we could add, yeah, right, a jewel in the crown. Now, The first nephew's remark is ironic if someone had ever thought that Uncle Jim is worthy of praise. And what nephew one does is dissociate himself from such an idea. And nephew's 2 reply echoes nephew's 1 remark. Both echoes clash cumulatively with the observed scenario, which is Uncle Jim's behavior, and the ironic effect is strengthened in this way. And this is the same effect that you could achieve by combining echoic markers like yeah, right, yeah, sure, right. Echoic markers are functionally very close. They show pretended agreement, and they can be said to encapsulate a thought echoically. When we say yeah, or yes, or right, or sure, we are not only expressing agreement, we are referring to a previous echo. So they encapsulate the previous echo. They may work alone, but they can also precede or follow a more complete echoic remark multiple times, emphasizing the ironic effect of the utterance. They may create formal reduplications, yes, yes, especially when they bear prosodic marking, but they tend to form conceptual or functional reduplications, like the case of yeah, right. And of course, repetition can be limitless, but it is unlikely that the number of echoes in conceptual reduplication will be constrained by it is likely that the number of echoes will be constrained by the balance between effort and effects that is put forward in relevance theory. Ironic markers are economic by nature, so reduplicating markers to reinforce the ironic echo is reasonable in terms of cognitive economy. So saying, yeah, right, she's an angel, of course, can be more easily interpreted as ironic than simply, yeah, an angel. But at the same time, yeah, an angel is more economical. And the repeated reduplication of markers might impose an unnecessary processing burden on the hearer. Yeah, right, that would be impossible to say, unless we have very special communicative reasons to do so. By way of conclusion, the notion of echo is central to understand verbal irony. Echoing has the status of a cognitive operation. It results in the construction of echoed scenarios. The true impact of echoic operations is to produce different types of ironic meaning effects. It hinges on their ability to produce different modalities of echoic expressions in terms of accuracy, completeness, and complexity. Echoic complexity can be achieved on the basis of sophisticated cultural references, but also on the basis of echoic compounding, cumulative echoing, and multi-operational echoes. And echoic marking plays a role similar to cumulative echoing in strengthening ironic meaning effects, especially through its ability to create formally and/or conceptually reduplicated echoes. And this is the end of the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. It was very interesting and it is mind-opening, I think. Any questions? Sorusu olan varsa yazabilir ya da el kaldırıp doğrudan sorabilirsiniz. I have a question for the echoic indices, the ironic indices. Is there a morphological marker you have encountered during your research in Spanish or in English?
Morphological.
Yes, so some morphological markers may be used more in ironic expressions.
Typically, what we find is yeah and right, or yeah and sure, and often in combination. Sometimes not, but often in combination. What we have to keep in mind is that the echo has basically the same meaning as the agreement adverb, yes. So when someone says, Mary is an angel, and you say, yes, with this tone of voice, what you mean is that you don't take it, you don't believe in it. You can say, Mary is an angel, also with the same tone of voice, and it will have the same meaning. Now, if you add yes to the echo, you strengthen the idea that you are ironical, that you're skeptical about what you say. Yes, Mary is an angel. If you say it twice, yes, right, or you combine it with another agreement adverb, you still strengthen the idea that you are ironic. I would say that the main function they have, so they have this enhancing function. The main function they have is to give clues to the hearer that we have irony, that irony is intended. Very often, everything that we do to strengthen an echo goes in that direction, in the direction of making sure that the hearer is going to understand that there is an assumption that is being questioned, that there is irony. If you're an ironist, a good ironist wants the audience to understand that he is being ironical and not simply saying, restating the same opinion or the same idea. And that would be the wrong thing to do as a speaker.
Okay,
I would say that you have, yeah, right. That's what I have found in English, also in Spanish. And I haven't found other markers than these, but I have been working with Inés Lozano and also with Sandra Peña and other people from my research group. And we collected hundreds of examples of irony from many different sources. And we found that this was constant. And there was complexity in irony, like the chains, accumulation, but the set of markers are always going to be agreement expressions in combination, at least in English. And I would also say that we have about the same case in the same situation in Spanish.
Thank you very much. In 2019, I had a student, master's students who worked on irony, and we found that the evidential marker "mış" in Turkish is used very prominently in irony, other than the other evidential markers. "Mış" is like it's a heard, it's a past tense, but it's heard, it's not witnessed by the speaker. So in irony, the speakers tend to use this evidential marker, and also the rhetorical questions are very frequent in irony in Turkish.
Interesting. A typological study on ironic marking would be necessary.
Yes.
And we have also noticed that there are some constructions that are potentially more ironic than others. Sometimes with similes that have an exaggeration component. X is like Y, and then Y is developed to such a degree that you begin to believe this is not literal, there is something ironic here. Yes, so we have some constructions that have a stronger ironic potential than others, but that doesn't mean that they are necessarily ironic. They have to be very well developed, and then of course they have to be interpreted in context. I would say that irony is mainly inferential, but we have very strong marking because speakers need to make sure that the hearer understands that there is irony. Unless you are an elitistic ironist and you're friends with someone, both of you have the same well-knowledge mental approach to life, the same feelings, and you want to be a separate group from the rest of the world, and then you make fun of other people without them realizing that you are making fun of them, then that would be a case in which the ironists do not want the hearers to know that there is irony. Yes, they make fun of people without the people realizing that they're being criticized. But that is a special case of irony. If you discard that special case, the rest of the situations follow the pattern that I have indicated.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
One of the things that you have to have in mind, because a lot of scholars think when they take the echoic approach, is that echoes are accurate. They are exact repetitions, because they have this idea of reported speech in mind. And in irony, it doesn't work that way. Most of the ironic echoes that we have come across are not accurate, and they're partial, because they direct, partiality is used to direct the hearer's attention to a certain aspect of the content of the message. The rest is simplicity. It is there. It's not discarded completely, but you focus attention on something. Mary is an angel, and she will always oblige. She's an angel. She's obliging, and she will always help other people. And then you only say, yeah, obliging and helps other people, and you forget about Mary's an angel. That's unnecessary. You're strengthening that other part, so it's meaningful from a communicative perspective.
Thank you very much. Tamam. Herhalde başka soru yok.
Yok gibi. Professor, thanks for your participating and sharing your valuable ideas with us.
You're welcome.
I want to ask whether are there any related studies which focus on the phonology and the echoic structures?
Yes. Yes. In fact, if you go to pragmatics, most of the work has been done from that perspective. They have tried to see which intonational patterns occur, how they vary. They have done some cross-cultural and cross-linguistic study on different kinds of pattern. So because all that work has already been done, we decided to focus on the content of irony. And there is, in fact, not much that can be said about the suprasegmental features and the intonation. You can go this far, and that's where you stop, and you have already exhausted you have finished with the issue. But if you go to how irony is articulated in context, to the different types of irony, depending on pragmatic functions and also on discourse functions, if you are able to pair the conceptual mechanisms that underlie how you use irony with those pragmatic functions, then you have an open field to work for years. And if you're able to get hold of the book that I mentioned in one of the slides on cognitive modeling and irony, you will see there's a whole book that is focused on this idea that we have complexity in irony. And of course, we give some of the background, historical background. We examine the difference between situational and verbal irony. We have a common framework for both of them. But the important thing is that irony can be complex. And the question is why? And the answer to the question is, think of conceptual complexity, how irony can be combined with, or echoes, for example. The echoic part of irony can be combined with other echoes, in what ways, and also think of how irony can be combined with hyperbole, with metaphor, with metonymy, and then a whole lot of different possibilities arise.
It refers to the shared knowledge, yeah. The cultural part would be considered, maybe.
Yes, the cultural, yeah. Irony we don't know much about all the historical facts about irony, and we have not explored to what extent irony is used in some cultures more than in others. We have a feeling that there are cultures that are extremely ironic, and the ancient Greek culture worked with irony a lot, and it was part of the way of constructing, for example, in the case of drama, it was central to teaching the audience through irony, right? Philosophers used irony to teach people, and that's very interesting. But it would be necessary to explore the thousands of cultures in the planet and see to what extent they make use of irony in any way. Is irony used in tribal cultures in the Amazonian jungle? I have no idea. So someone should do that kind of field work. And we might be surprised to find that they may use irony depending on contexts, if they find it useful, or that they can be trained into understanding irony if they don't use it at all. But we need to do that kind of work. It's the focus on irony for example, in literary criticism has always been literature, and literature is in the Latin and Greek culture and all the developments of Western culture. And then we still need to go into, well, you have a lot of irony in the Bible and it's Hebrew culture. And I don't know about Mesopotamian culture in general, but I think it could be ironic. But what about Chinese culture? How ironic is it? They understand irony, but how productive is it? We don't know. Because we need to explore the phenomenon. To explore the phenomenon, the first thing that we need is a framework, and we didn't have a framework. Probably with these developments in cognition and pragmatics being hand in hand, we are coming close to having the framework that we can apply to different cultural situations, and then find out how irony, the different components of irony, can be handled in different cultures, if they are handled at all.
Thank you.
Do you use irony in Turkey?
We have another question.
Another question.
Yes, I was asking you, how often do you use irony in daily life in Turkey?
Okay. We use a lot.
We use it out, yeah.
Yes.
We can define Turkish people very ironic throughout life. And before Esra asks her question, I would like to mention a tendency among young people and among caricaturists in Turkish. They change to signal the irony or sarcasm. They change the vowels. For instance, there's a caricature, it's very famous. It says, "Teşekkürler Superman." It's "Thank you, Superman." But the other person tells the "Teşekkürler Superman." It changes the vowels in the words, and it's a bit irony, or it's a bit sarcasm, and there's different ways to mention irony or sarcasm, and a lot of people use this. After the caricature, a lot of people start to use this in their daily life and in their Twitter posts or other social media posts. So I think Turkish people are very ironic, and we have also lots of funny historical characters like Nasreddin Hoca. It's very famous with its funny stories, or other comics, other theatrical persons, actors, or dramatists. So I think Turkish is very ironic. The Turkish culture is very keen to irony.
Yeah, we have folk shows which make use of ironies.
Yes, full of ironies, and there are lots of data.
And one thing that we have noticed is that younger people use irony, especially teenagers and also young adults in their 20s, early 30s, use irony a lot more than older people.
Yes.
In general. And that's an interesting psychological phenomenon that has to be investigated. And another thing that we have noticed, and we've been doing empirical work with some colleagues from the psychology department, is that irony is handled differently in individuals with high capacity. We have a research team in our university that has been working for decades on high intellectual ability, HIA. And they work even with children, also with some teenagers, and they help them in different fields to exploit and to develop their abilities. And we run a series of tests with them to see how they handled and how they detected irony. And we were surprised to see that very young people, children, were capable of handling irony because of their high intellectual ability a lot better than the control group. And that irony, we postulated on those grounds, that irony could perhaps be an indicator of high intellectual ability. You know that they do these tests and they try to find if we have a subject that has high intellectual ability, because if it goes unspotted, that person could be in trouble for the rest of their lives, right? So we don't want that to happen. We need to identify those people, and one of the ways is to include in the battery of tests that they take cases of irony to see how they handle it, and it could be an indicator, a diagnostic tool of high intellectual ability. And they handle irony in more creative ways, in very unexpected ways, in fact. And regular irony is boring for them. So the kind of irony that you see in sitcoms, it's like trivial for them. And we made this is pure speculation, but there might be a connection between the fact, the observation that older people reject irony or have a tendency to abandon irony, and these high intellectual ability subjects having the same approach to irony at a much earlier age. It's like, this is trivial, yes, please don't use irony again, don't use irony, I mean, I got it. So they have a negative attitude to irony at some point, unless the irony is attractive, unless it is special, unless it is very complex. So complexity again comes in. And this is something that has to be explored. It could be a diagnostic tool for highly competent, highly gifted individuals, and it could also be an explanation of psychological behavior at older ages. And where is culture here? Maybe it changes with culture, but because we're only focused on Western culture, when we explore irony, we don't take any step further into a different direction. We are never gonna know unless someone does that. I would say that it's something that it is necessary, and probably if we do it, it should be very exciting.
We have another question.
Yes.
Sesim geliyor mu hocam? Önce onu sorayım.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Tamamdır. First of all, thank you for your presentation. And I just wonder, and I ask this question, can we use nonverbal expressions to understand verbal ironies? For example, when we think the opposite of something of someone says, or when we do not believe it, we can remain silent, or we can just giggling it. And if so, if we can use these cues for verbal ironies, what is the power of this for the hearer? And is it as effective as our verbal response? Thank you.
So the question is about whether, let me see if I understood correctly, whether we can have ironic situations where we not use without any verbal approach to irony. And then
Yes.
we have situations in which we actually use utterances to have an ironic impact.
Yes, yes,
But
of course.
we can
Yes.
remain, and we can remain silent, and still irony arise, something like
Yes.
that. Yes.
Yes.
Then we have to make a distinction between situational and verbal irony. This is a classical distinction. To give you an example of situational irony, imagine that you're a pilot and you develop fear of flying. And people will say, well, that's ironical. He's been a pilot for 3 decades and now he's unable to take a flight because he's fearful. And that's an ironical situation. You don't need to say anything. You simply detect the situation. But you can also comment on it and say ironically, so a pilot, and laugh at the situation, or simply say it like tongue-in-cheek, like, yeah, right, you're a pilot. And then you think, and you're unable to take a flight. You're unable to fly now. So that's an ironical situation. You don't need to use language in ironical situations. And in these ironical situations, there is no echoic component because there is no verbalization. You don't need to express pretended agreement. You simply see something that happens. It runs counter to expectations, and you think that, well, this deserves a laugh or something like that. That's situational irony. Another example of situational irony, which is a very typical one, imagine that you have the police headquarters and you see that there's someone stealing stuff from the police and they don't even realize. They think, okay, that should be a safe place, one of the safest in town, and someone is robbing the police headquarters. So interesting. That would be situational irony. Excuse me. You don't need to say anything at all, and the situation is ironic by itself. Now, whether you respond verbally to a situation like that or not is optional. The situation is going to be ironic by itself. You may react and you may say something, but that's because you have an audience. And the situation has an ironic target. The police could be an ironic target. The pilot could be an ironic target. You're ironizing on those people. And you need an audience for that if you want to, if you want them to be a target. So you could combine both verbal and situational irony, but it isn't necessary. In situational irony, what you have is one situation that clashes with your expectations. Your expectations we call in our research the epistemic scenario. It is your knowledge or anything in context that you incorporate into your knowledge background. That's the epistemic scenario. And it clashes with what you see, what you observe. So you have an observable scenario, and then you have an epistemic scenario, and the epistemic scenario goes in parallel, or is the parallel of the echoic scenario in verbal irony. So we have about the same conceptual situation, but you don't give any clue to a hearer because there is no hearer necessarily. You can incorporate it, but that's optional.
Okay, thank you for your response.
You're welcome. That was, in fact, a very interesting question because of lack of time, I didn't explain this difference between situational and verbal irony. And if I had, I would have mentioned this idea that they go in parallel, because scholars have said they have to be studied in dissociation apart from each other, and it is not true. They're the same phenomenon. So you don't go into situational irony and create a different theory for situational irony than you create for verbal irony. You have to work on them together.
We don't have any other questions. Dear Professor, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and presenting this valuable knowledge to us.
It's been a pleasure for me.
I hope to see you in Turkey in person also.
Me too. So thank you very much for your kind invitation. It was a real pleasure and a privilege for me.
It's a pleasure.
And please feel free to give my email address to the participants if they want to
Okay,
ask questions, because you have been recording this and they may come up with questions after they see the recording.
Okay, we will add your email address to the YouTube video. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So I will stop sharing the presentation now.
Okay. Dear Professor, thank you for sharing your valuable ideas with us. And thanks coming from the chat box, you can also see. We would like to see you all in next week's presentation. We will be hosting Dr. Yağmur Sağ from the Harvard University. This will be our 73 conversation, I think. Okay.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Katıldığınız için teşekkür ederim herkese. Görüşmek üzere.
Görüşmek üzere. Teşekkürler. Haftaya görüşmek üzere.